Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
What price a strong and stable government? The bill for ensuring that Theresa May can rely on the 10 votes of Northern Ireland's DUP is £1 billion. That's over £500 for each citizen of Northern Ireland, or £100 million for each of the 10 DUP MPs' votes. That's the economics. What about the political price of spending a sum that could have paid for example, a 2% pay rise for NHS staff? Something Theresa May said wasn't possible before the election. Do you remember when she spoke to that nurse on Question Time and said there is no magic money tree for a pay rise for you? In return for DUP support, the government has found that magic money tree and promised to spend around £1 billion extra on projects in Northern Ireland, upgrading roads, installing broadband, tackling deprivation and giving extra cash to schools and hospitals. But many want to know if the money can be found for buying votes in Northern Ireland. If it can be found for buying those votes, why can't it be found elsewhere? Let's speak now to SNP MP Kirsty Blackman. The SNP have described this as a grubby, shameless deal. Rebecca Webster is a student nurse. Nurses haven't had a pay rise in England and Wales since 2009. And Elliot, who doesn't want us to use his surname, has mental health issues and says he's been affected by cuts. Steve Rotherham, Metro Mayor of the Liverpool City region, he says if money can be found for Northern Ireland, it should go to the rest of the UK too. Downing Street said diary commitments prevented any ministers joining our conversation, so instead they put up the Conservative MP, James Cleverly. Good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for talking to us. Mr Cleverly, where did Theresa May find that magic money tree then?
Well, the amount of money that has been associated with the confidence and supply arrangement with the DUP will come from the same place that all public expenditure comes from, which is from taxation. Of course, what we had at the last general election was a hung parliament, and when you have a hung parliament, you come to agreements with other political parties, and there are policy implications of that. And obviously, the MPs from Northern Ireland wanted to see expenditure in Northern Ireland, increased public expenditure in Northern Ireland, to go on things, as you say, like infrastructure, schools, health, etc., etc.
But how is it justified to find £1 billion to keep Mrs May in power, but no money, for example, to give nurses a pay rise?
Well, nurses have had a pay rise. There's been a pay freeze for years. There's been a public sector pay rise cap. And that, I know, has put financial pressure on a lot of public service professionals. But the amount of expenditure that's been going into the NHS from the government is still at a record high. It has been increasing, will continue to increase throughout this Parliament. But I think it's understandable that when you enter, hung Parliament negotiations, the parties that you're negotiating with fight their corner for their part of the country. That's understandable. That's completely acceptable. Well, and it's a natural byproduct of hung parliaments.
Yeah, not necessarily. You could have run the country as a Conservative minority government. You didn't have to spend £1 billion in order to keep Mrs May in power.
Well, what is best for the UK, particularly as we go through the Brexit negotiations, is to have a government which has that ability to govern properly, that's not on a knife edge on every vote. And actually, if we get the Brexit negotiations right, that £1 billion of expenditure will be more than repaid by the increased economic activity, the increased tax take. If we had frankly chaotic situation of a Labour-led coalition government, I think the British economy would suffer, and the damage to the UK economy would eclipse that £1 billion of extra expenditure going into Northern Ireland.
Will the DUP only get the money if a Northern Ireland power-sharing deal goes ahead?
The DUP are not getting the money. Northern Ireland is getting the money. Well, and what we've said...
OK, so let me ask the question again. Will Northern Ireland only get the money if a Northern Ireland power-sharing deal goes ahead?
My understanding is that the money is committed to, but what we want is we want the Northern Ireland executive to choose how to spend the money. And the best thing for those people...
So you're saying they'll get the money even if there is no power-sharing deal between the parties in Northern Ireland?
My understanding, and I haven't seen the full details. I've seen the public document that was released, is that the money is for the Northern Ireland executive to spend, and the best way for that to happen is for all the political parties in Northern Ireland to get back to Stormont and take over devolved government, because what we want here in Westminster is for the Northern Ireland executive to run those devolved issues in Northern Ireland. That's our desire, and that's what we're aiming for.
Okay, but you're not clear on that, so that does need clarification. Let me bring in our other guests who have questions for you. Kirsty Blackman is here. She's an SNP MP. We have the Metro Mayor of Liverpool, Steve Rotherham. We have Rebecca Webster, who's a student nurse. We have Elliot, who has mental health issues and has been affected by austerity. Who would like to talk to James Cleverly first, as a representative of the Conservative government?
Can I just ask, James, you say that it's best for the UK going into Brexit negotiations. I'd just like to raise the point that I don't think that Brexit is not what just makes the UK, and as I'm a student nurse, obviously working within the NHS at the moment, there are other priorities. How can you say that allocating it? Should this £1 billion not be distributed according to the issues and the demand of the UK in other areas as well? Because the NHS isn't just suffering in Northern Ireland, it's suffering across the whole of the UK. It was called a humanitarian crisis during winter. So how can we justify putting it all in one place when it's needed throughout the whole of the United Kingdom?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually NHS expenditure right across the UK has been increasing and is going to continue to increase. That was a commitment that the government made and absolutely will honour. And you also say about targeting areas of need. Without a shadow of doubt, Northern Ireland has suffered enormously over previous decades. It has significant pockets of deprivation. It has significant areas of need, and so I completely understand the DUP wanting to see an enhanced level of public expenditure in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland does have enhanced needs, and so I think it is entirely reasonable and practical for the government to do that.
You're saying that the money is being put there. However, I can tell you that I'm working on the wards, I'm working in the community, and I'm working with these nurses who have been in the job for 30 years or so, and they're saying to me that they're doing more with less. So if you're saying that the money is there, why can't I see it? Why am I going into wards and seeing the revolving doors of mental health patients being brought in, be put on medication and then sent home without the tools or the resources to be able to cope in the community? I don't want to be told more money has been put in here. I need to be able to see it. It's not working. Whatever is happening at the moment is not working.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I can't comment on the circumstances of the wards that you work on, but I know the NHS is under pressure. We've got a growing population, we have an ageing population. The government has recognised that, and that's why it has committed to an ongoing increase in NHS expenditure to try and meet those increased demands. And I know that, at the front line, in the wards, in the hospitals, public service professionals are under pressure. We completely recognise that. Okay. And that's why that extra expenditure is going into the NHS.
Let me bring in Steve Rotherham. He's the Metro Mayor of the Liverpool City region. Hello, Mr Rotherham. Do talk to Mr Cleverly.
Well, I think James has drawn the short straw, really, and it's hardly the most sophisticated arguments, is it, to say that we've come up with a formula for Northern Ireland, and basically that's to buy off 10 votes. Let's face the facts that, and not kid ourselves, that this whole deal with the DUP is to try and dig the government out of a very deep hole and out of doo-doo that is of their own creation. And I just wonder whether James regrets some of the statements that were made before the general election, given the state of his party currently.
What statements, Steve?
Well, such as a coalition of chaos, for instance, James. Isn't that exactly what you're creating now with this shoddy and grubby deal with the DUP?
No, I think the point we made about the chaotic nature of a Jeremy Corbyn-led coalition is absolutely justified. So for Jeremy Corbyn to even attempt to form a government, he would need to create some kind of rainbow coalition, which would numerically have to include the DUP as well. I think it's completely legitimate to say that trying to bind together...
You knew the outcome of the general election, James, did you? You knew the outcome, so you already did the maths on what it was going to be, this coalition post-general election that Jeremy Corbyn was going to enter into. So I hope if that's the case that you had a bet on it, because you'd be a very, very rich man now. It just appears that irony is lost on you. You said before about infrastructure investment for Northern Ireland. It's exactly what John McDonnell has been asking for years with the Tory government. So are you saying that Tory investment in Northern Ireland is good, but Labour investment in the rest of the UK would have been bad for the economy?
No, what we've said is Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's maths didn't even start to add up.
So where did you get the level of it from?
Let me answer your question, Steve. The level of expenditure that was embedded in the Labour manifesto was just completely uncredible. It was incredible. It was at levels.
Not like your manifesto, wasn't it?
Can I answer the question, mate? It was at levels which would be completely unsustainable. In terms of infrastructure, well, the Conservative government has committed to significant amounts of infrastructure in the north of England, in the northwest of England. We've been committed to major infrastructure projects like HS2, which will bind fantastic cities like your own with the other major cities around the UK, share that prosperity. So I'm very proud of the commitment that the government has made to infrastructure expenditure around the UK, but we also recognise that Northern Ireland has, because of its history, because of the history of the Troubles, it's had a unique history which has held it back economically for a very long time. And I completely understand the DUP wanting to see plans put in place that will help lift the Northern Irish economy.
OK, well, let's bring in Kirsty Blackman, who is an SNP MP. Do talk to James Cleverly, Kirsty.
I don't understand how the government can justify this deal. It's £1 billion for Northern Ireland. It's investment in things like health and education, which the government has now suddenly overnight decided that is definitely necessary in Northern Ireland but not anywhere else in the UK. And we're not seeing the same amount of money going into health and education services elsewhere in the UK. Now, our manifesto that we stood on had an increase for the NHS in England because we wanted to see the NHS in England get more money, and we wanted to see consequentials of that come to Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. How can the Tories justify giving this extra money to Northern Ireland and excluding the rest of the parts of the UK that are in need of this cash?
Well, Kirsty, I'm surprised to hear you say that. You know as well as I do that government expenditure per capita in Scotland is higher than it is in England, and I think it's a bit unfair that you begrudge a higher per capita expenditure in Northern Ireland.
We recognise, it's already significantly higher in Northern Ireland than it is even in Scotland.
Yeah,
so you need to be careful with this argument.
No, in Scotland it's significantly higher than it is in England, and we recognise that devolved governments and certain parts of the country have greater need than others, and public expenditure is counterbalanced to take that into consideration. But you know that health and education is are devolved issues in Scotland, and if the SNP government in Holyrood wants to see more money in those areas of public expenditure, they can raise taxes. They have the power to do that, and they can spend money on, frankly, what we both know to be health and education outcomes in Scotland significantly lower than they are in England. That's your choice.
But you think it's justifiable for Westminster government to give money to the Northern Ireland executive to spend in health and education, but you wouldn't do so for Scotland? Why is it a different case?
We already do so for Scotland.
You're not giving an additional £2.9 billion it would be for Scotland to spend on health and education.
Expenditure in Scotland, just public expenditure in Scotland, just like in the rest of the UK,
is lower per head than Northern Ireland.
Has been increasing. And I said, there are different levels. The government spends money in, different levels across the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland per head of population, receives more than Scotland, but Scotland in turn receives significantly more than England. That's the way it is. And actually, as a unionist party, as a government for the whole of the UK, we feel it's entirely appropriate to distribute money from some of the wealthier parts of the UK to some of the parts of the UK who need a boost to build their economy and public services.
Let me bring in Elliot.
I'll take you up on that offer, James. If you want to speak to your government, if you're talking about an area of the country that needs some additional help, well, we can very, very easily help our area by, for instance, some of the infrastructure projects that we have online, HS3, as it was called, Northern Powerhouse Rail or Crossrail for the North. The government should start that as soon as possible, and if we start from Liverpool and work towards Manchester, we can link the whole Northern Corridor. But you can't say that the government specifically looks at areas with deprivation and helps them areas out. We've had £1.5 billion cumulatively cut from the 6 districts in the Liverpool City region, 1.5 billion, and you've just given £1 billion to Northern Ireland. How is that justifiable?
The government's invested huge amounts in Northern Powerhouse projects. I mean, your own city's seen a transformation. It's seen an absolute transformation.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's because we've got a good council, and that's because we've had a Labour government and European funding in the past that has helped us to pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps.
And central government funding, though. You have to.
I'm going to bring in Elliot, if I may.
There has been central government funding.
Hi there.
Elliot's been very patient.
I do want to say I live in Liverpool currently. I've moved from the south up to Liverpool for university. And to see a Conservative MP stand there and have the audacity to say that you have put money into Liverpool. Liverpool is a world-class city. It's absolutely nothing to do with you and everything to do with European finances and projects. That city was built from ruins. If we're being honest, Liverpool was in ruins, especially after the end of the Thatcher government. Margaret Thatcher wanted to leave the city to decline. She wanted to leave that city to the point where it was in such ruins it was uninhabitable. If it wasn't for the EU money, Liverpool would not exist in the capacity that it does now. So do not dare stand on national TV and praise yourself for that city, because you have nothing to be proud of in that city. Let me make my second point. The deprivation in Ireland has not happened overnight. It has not happened in the last week. Ireland has not collapsed. Northern Ireland has not become deprived overnight. It has been deprived for the entire time you have been in government. So why is it suddenly now, when Theresa May needs to cling on to power, because that's what she's doing, let's not kid ourselves, let's not joke, let's not lie and say this is in the national interest, it's directly in your interest. Why now, after 7 years of power, are you so interested in injecting £1 billion of public money? It's not Conservative money, it is public money that could be distributed to mental health nurses, to schools, to public sectors. But no, because you want to cling to power, because you have got a woman who does not understand the electorate, does not understand the message she's been given by the public, she has now bribed the Northern Irish Assembly with £1 billion to keep her into power. Justify that for me now, please.
Well, that money, I mean, you mentioned mental health services. Northern Ireland still has the highest...
What I've asked you to do is justify £1 billion to the
I'm answering your question.
No, you're not. You're doing what Tories do, is you're deflecting to other points. It's a simple question. Justify to me in simple terms why you think now, after 7 years in government, after 7 years of austerity, now is the time to give Northern Ireland and nobody else in the country £1 billion at a point where your government, by your own doing, by your own making, is in crisis. Justify that now. Without saying any Tory soundbites, if you're going to be clear, lay it out in simple layman terms, please, because it's an affront.
The government has increased spending right across the country, including Scotland, Wales, England. Government expenditure has increased. We have been increasing expenditure in Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland has some of the most significant issues because of its history. You mentioned mental health services. It has the highest suicide rate per capita in the whole of the UK, and it's entirely appropriate that we recognise the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland. We are in a coalition, or sorry, not a coalition, we are in a hung parliament situation. That means that we have to negotiate with other parties, and that means that the policies that the government put forward get adapted and amended in negotiation with those parties. That's what happens in hung parliament situations. That's what we've done.
That's all very admirable, and if you were doing it off your own back, if you'd won this election and you turned around and said, do you know what? Northern Ireland is so deprived, we need to invest immediately because it's, you know, it's a terrible place. But that's not what's happened.
No, we have already committed to an upturn in
£1 billion would not be going to the Northern Irish Assembly. It just wouldn't be happening because it wouldn't be your priority. Because at the moment, your priority is clinging to power at the detriment to this country. You're an affront to this country.
Let him respond, then.
Our priority is doing what is right for the UK, and I have absolutely no doubt that a government led by Jeremy Corbyn would have been a catastrophe for this government.
You don't have a mandate.
That's why we have entered into an agreement with another political party in the UK to form a stable government. That's what happens when you have hung parliament situations. And those negotiations have meant that in addition to the additional spending that we are putting into health and public services around the rest of the UK, we are also putting additional spending into Northern Ireland, above that which was already planned for, of course, but that is the byproduct of a hung parliament agreement.
Okay, thank you, all of you, very much. Thank you to Elliot, thank you to Rebecca Webster, to SNP MP Kirsty Blackman, and to the Metro Mayor of Liverpool, Steve Rotherham. And thank you very much to James Cleverly, who gave up his time at the last minute to talk on behalf of the Conservative government. Thank you. We appreciate your time, all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.